Okay, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Dr. Abby Zoltik, Director of Education for the Veterinary Association for Farm Animal Welfare. For those of you unfamiliar with VAFAW, our mission is to advocate for animals used in food and fiber production by providing a veterinary perspective grounded in animal welfare science and ethics. We accomplish this through education, policy development, advocacy, and collaborative animal care. VAFA currently has three areas of focus: preventing and mitigating pain experienced by farm animals, promoting living environments that meet the animal's physical and psychological needs, and lastly, ensuring humane end-of-life practices. If you are not yet a member of VAFA but would like to become one, please send us your name through the Q&A box located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or you can visit www.vafa.org. And membership is open to anyone who supports our mission, and the first year of membership is free. We are very excited to launch the first webinar in our series, Promoting Living Environments That Meet the Animal's Physical and Psychological Needs, with Dr. Jeremy Marchant speaking to us today about housing systems for sows and gilts. VAFA works to advance housing systems that protect animals from disease and injury and provide them with opportunities for agency, positive engagement with their environment and with their conspecifics, and the expression of natural behaviors. Today's presentation will focus on improving living environments for commercial sows. This is an important issue for VAFA, and you can go to the Education tab on our website to find our position statement on sow and gilt gestation housing. Globally, the predominant system of housing for commercial sows is intensive confinement. Sows are typically housed in crates that severely limit movement. Recently, California's Proposition 12 was upheld by the Supreme Court, mandating that many pork products sold in California must be from farms with space allowances of at least 24 square feet per sow during breeding and gestation. And due to California's out-of-state pork imports, Proposition 12 has resulted in producers across the country transitioning to group housing to comply with these standards. However, increasing space allowance and switching to group housing systems is not enough to ensure an adequate level of welfare for all pregnant pigs. And this introduces an important question: how can we avoid negative welfare outcomes and promote positive welfare among group housed sows? We are fortunate to have Dr. Jeremy Marchant here with us today to help answer this question. As an animal welfare researcher working with pigs, I seek out Dr. Marchant's work when I have questions or need inspiration. And it doesn't require much effort to find these answers or to find this inspiration due to his prolific contributions to the field. Dr. Jeremy Marchant is currently the chief scientist with Organic Plus Trust, with responsibility for Global Animal Partnerships Animal Welfare Certified Program. He was previously a research animal scientist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specializing in the welfare and behavior of pigs and dairy cattle. Dr. Marchant obtained his PhD in gestating cell welfare at the University of Cambridge Veterinary School. He has published 4 books and hundreds of peer-reviewed articles and abstracts on farm animal welfare. Dr. Marchant, we are very excited to have you here with us today, and I'll go ahead and turn things over to you.
We'll come off mute. Thank you very much, Abby, for that kind introduction. Very happy to be here with everybody. Right, let's start sharing. Right, as Abby said, I am the Chief Scientist for Organic Plus Trust. That is a certifying body for organic grass-fed dairy and beef. But at the moment, really, I'm 100% working on, we also manage the global animal partnership scheme, and I'm working pretty much 100% on revising standards for global animal partnership. I was on the scientific advisory board of GAP prior to leaving my role with USDA. So I'm not unfamiliar with well, especially the pig standards. But now obviously I'm spreading out more and doing standards across all species. So what I'm going to talk to you today is really, I've been working with pigs from a research point of view since 1990 when I began my PhD at Cambridge with Don Broom, who was the world's first professor of animal welfare. Prior to that, I mean, I grew up, my granddad always kept a few pigs. He also worked on a pig farm that I went and helped out on during vacations and things like that. So in terms of my knowledge of a particular species, pigs is really where I'm at. I did do a little bit of dairy cattle research as well in the past. But pigs are my first love, I guess, in terms of an animal to work with. So what we're going to cover is we're going to talk about sow housing, where we are now, how we got here. Whenever I'm giving talks on these kind of general talks on welfare issues with pigs, I really like to go back and revisit natural behavior because it helps explain a lot of why we have welfare problems when we bring them into housing. So we're going to cover some of that in terms of the sow, especially. We're going to have a little bit of look at some system comparisons. We're going to talk about five domains, which has kind of moved on from the five freedoms and where that originated and how it kind of fits into what we're going to talk about. We're going to cover some of those key factors as to why people tend to struggle with group housing systems. What are the key factors and what can we do to mitigate some of those and smooth the transition? And then right at the end, we'll cover a little bit about what I hope is going to be some future trends within pig housing here in the US, especially. So, of course, we're dealing with a public who really doesn't know what we do in livestock production, how our animals are housed. And if you think about, what the public thinks of when they think farms, they think the stereotypical red barn, small farm, family farm, animals out in the fields. And of course, that is, as we know, pretty far from reality for the vast majority of the animals and birds that are reared over here in the US. How did we get there? Well, we have intensified pretty rapidly over the last half century, really. When you look at agricultural production, well, if we go back in time, it took 100 years to double between 1820 and 1920. Then it took 30 years to double. Then it took 15 years to double. Then it took only 10 years to double. And of course, we have to remember, though, that there was post-war need for an increase in livestock production. There were a lot of countries were giving out government incentives to get farmers to increase productivity. And of course, technology was coming on the scene as well. So now, when I kind of fly over the US, especially, I play a game and I try to figure out what kind of livestock farms I'm flying over. And when you think about it and you look down, it's unless you really know what you're looking for, it's quite difficult to figure out. I mean, a lot of people probably not even sure that these are livestock farms, those that look out of the window. But this one, for example, we can see that it is dairy cattle. We've got milking parlours, we've got long, indoor cubicle housing, and some slurry pits. This one is going to be broiler farm, long, narrow houses, low level. We've got a good idea that's broiler. This one is also going to be poultry, but it's laying hens. We've got tall buildings, so we know that these are likely cage systems. And again, we have a slurry pit. Of course, this one is the different one. This is beef cattle. This one's actually down in Arizona, of all places. About 120,000 cattle here. And if you had the ability to zoom in, you would see that they do at least give them shading in this particular feedlot. And then we get to this one, which is classically pigs, with a large slurry pit, for example, probably likely to be a contract finishing or the grower finisher, something like that. The other thing that is happening worldwide is that, of course, the livestock production is increasing drastically in different parts of the world at different rates. By now, when we get to kind of, North America and Europe, we're pretty consistent and there's not a lot of growth. But obviously, the red here is the area of major growth over the last 20, 30 years. And that is Asia, where we've seen this massive increase in production. Another one to keep an eye on is going to be blue. It's going to be Africa. We're definitely beginning to see some indication that intensive types of livestock farming is moving into that continent, and it's certainly going to be another one to keep an eye on in terms of how fast that continent is going to increase and intensify. And when we think about China, I mean, I'm sure any of you who work with pigs have seen a picture of this one, which is the 26-story pig farm, for want of a better word, in China. And that has the ability to raise, I think, about 1.2 million pigs on an annual basis. A lot of people look at this and say how kind of you look at comments on posts for this, and it's how grotesque, how horrible, how, awful it is. But really, to the pig inside one of these, is it very different from the life of the pig in one of our flat pig farms over here in the US? Probably from a pig's perspective, not too different in terms of the type of life that they are leading and the experiences that they are having. But I understand, in some ways it really does kind of look, a step too far in some ways. When you look again at the US in terms of farming and data, we can go back and look at the ag census data collected by USDA. If we go back 50 years, go back to 1978, in terms of pig farms, at that time, we actually had 500,000 farms that have pigs on them. Obviously, the vast majority are very small, in the 1 to 99 and 100 to 500 range. And thereafter, not very many as we get bigger. So 5,000 plus in 1978, there were only 240. Now in 2022, there are 3,540. So in 2022, in total, there are 61,000 farms. So the number of pig farms has dropped kind of tenfold, I guess, almost. And correspondingly, when we then look at how many pigs there are being farmed in the US, well, in 1978, there were 59 million pigs. And when you divided that by that 500,000 farms, we knew that overall, the average herd size is going to be around about 115. In 2022, we're now up to 74 million pigs, and that average herd size has grown up to 1,214. Bearing in mind that we still have, actually, if I go back, we still have, out of 61,000 farms, 47,920 are in that 1 to 99 pig range. So we have a lot of what I would call almost 4-H type farms. You've got here, you've probably got an average herd size. It's nowhere near the 99. It's round about 6 to 10, something like that. So there's a lot of people who are keeping very, very few pigs. And then at the end of the equation, we have around about 5% of our farms, which up here in the 5,000 plus, which are actually holding 75% of the pig herd. So, and even over the last 15 years, 2007, 2017, 2022, we see that trend towards more pigs from the national herd being kept on larger farms. And so that's where we are. So when we think about gestating sow housing, the end result of this intensification has been the gestation crate, or the sow stall, as we used to call it in the UK. And why has this happened? Well, Economics, of course, have played a major role. Stocking density, you can get a lot more sows in a given amount of space. It's cost effective. We've brought in automation, a lot of concrete. We've got less labor looking after the same number of animals. We've got less straw. We've got no straw in the vast majority, of course, of cases. Whereas in the UK, of course, we were still very much using straw based. And the farm that I used to work on was a 500 sow unit, entirely straw bedded, which is labor intensive because there's a lot of mucking out that has to be done. There's a lot of cost in terms of that straw as well. Ease of management, individual care, I put in kind of inverted commas, because there's a lot less husbandry skills needed. And this is a big area in terms of why we are so struggling when we now move away from this type of system into group housing systems, is that the vast majority of our carers have lost those skills necessary to look after pigs and sows in group housing systems. No doubt that this type of system reduces that skill level, the skill level needed for the carers to look after the pigs. So there's a whole number of reasons why we have moved towards that. But like I say, economics have driven it and public demand for cheaper product. Let's not forget our role in intensification. So let's go backwards again to natural behavior and think about to better understand, I always like to say, to better understand the impact of housing on pig welfare and how better to manage pigs' behaviour in our current systems, we do need to take a step back. And with the pig, we're very lucky to be able to do that because we can go straight back to its ancestor, the wild boar. And there's a lot of really good literature on the wild boar that will help us understand better the domestic sow. And so when we think about social housing for wild boar, social grouping for wild boar, they exist in what we call sounders, and that is usually 2 to 4 adult females. They are related. They're either going to be mother with daughters or they're going to be sisters. Associated with them, we have unweaned juveniles, and then we also have sub-adults from previous litters. Boars will associate with those groups during the breeding season, and that group size invariably is going to vary according to season and the available resources. Groups will distribute around resources, and the boars will distribute around groups. Importantly, from a behavior point of view, sows within that group are dominant to all other members, and among themselves, they'll have a fairly strict hierarchy. Overt aggression in these core groups is very rare. I mean, you will see dominant sows displacing subordinates from choice feeding sites. When the sows give birth, they isolate themselves, nest build, give birth, and some days later will begin to introduce the litter into that group. So there's a gradual introduction of litters into the group. They're not territorial, so you won't find them defending a territory. What they will do, each sounder will have a home range, and in fact, those home ranges can overlap, but the groups themselves, the sounders themselves, won't interact. And so you might think, well, okay, where's the relevance? This is not the same animal, surely. Well, we're lucky enough to have some really good data on domestic pigs, both out of Edinburgh, the pig park in Edinburgh, and a lot of really good stuff out of Skara in Sweden, where they basically just released pigs out into natural woodland and studied them. And what we do find, and then we've also got plenty of feral pig populations as well around the world. And when we study these animals, we know that domestic pigs will very much behave like wild boar. So those domestic pigs will form family groups, small core groups of related females plus progeny, solitary males associating with groups at mating. The groups may share common space again in home ranges, but do not merge together. They maintain distance from each other. Even when foraging, average distance between group members, the same group is 4 meters. So we're beginning to introduce that concept of space and how much space pigs like. Aggression in core groups is very rare, maybe one aggressive interaction, and it's going to be, very, very brief. It might even just be a threat rather than any kind of very overt aggression. One every couple of hours per animal. The major strategy is avoidance. And so contrasting features. And so when we look at this and think about natural behavior and how we farm our pigs, we think about group size. We know naturally it's small. Farmed, obviously, it could be single if they're housed in close confinement systems, but it can be very large, with certainly some large grow finish group sizes, could be 100, 200 animals. Social structure is relatively stable in a natural environment. Obviously, there will be some new members of the group, but they will be related. They will be the new litters being introduced to the rest of the group members. Other than that, it's pretty stable. Farmed, that social structure is going to be quite unstable. They're related in a natural situation. Of course, there's a fair degree of genetic similarity, I would say, within a farmed population, but in terms of relatedness, it's going to be variable. Within that natural grouping, we have this very wide age size profile. That is very helpful when it comes to establishing hierarchies. Of course, in the farm situation, we tend to have a very narrow age and size profile. We like to group pigs together by age and by size. When it comes to finishing pigs and growing pigs, we tend to put them into pens the same size. So we have narrow profiles. Space, of course, naturally, it's absolutely unlimited. In a farm situation, it is restricted. And the degree of restriction will vary depending on the type of system we have, but it's still restricted relative to the natural environment. Behavioral repertoire, for pigs is complex. In a natural environment, they can perform that complex behavioral repertoire. In a farm situation, there are going to be constraints placed upon them in terms of what they can do. Activity, naturally, pigs are very active. Certainly peaks of activity around dawn and dusk, an awful lot of foraging during the day, searching for food. Farm situation, the main thing that pigs are doing naturally is foraging. Don't need to do that in a farm situation. You've got the food there, either in front of you all the time. If you're grow finishing population, it's there once a day, maybe twice a day if you're lactating. But as I say, once a day you're fed and it's gone. So a lot of our indoor house pigs certainly spend an awful lot of time inactive in an environment that really doesn't encourage them to be particularly active. So in general, I would say that the more intensive the management system, the greater the alteration and conflict with natural behaviour, and consequently, the greater those welfare challenges. And as we move through the types of systems that we might encounter in pig production in the UK, we have an awful lot of that first picture of pigs housed outside year round. We still have a lot of straw available, even for the ones that are indoors. And then we moved into the more intensive systems where we don't have bedding into that close confinement as the kind of ultimate. Then obviously we are constraining the behavior of those pigs, the natural behavior of those pigs, and you can begin to understand why we have the welfare challenges that we do. So it's not, we're talking about Prop 12, but really, the welfare of sows in gestation crates has been an issue for some time. Certainly, I'd say it's been an issue for about 60 years, to a lesser extent for farrowing crates as well. We've also got welfare issues with battery cages, similarly for about the last 60 years, and veal crates. And in some ways, these are kind of like I would term the trifecta of close confinement, where we have that kind of legislation outlawing close confinement. Within the US, it's tending to focus on gestation crates, battery cages, veal crates, as a kind of grouping together. So if we think, well, where did this suddenly come from 60 years ago? For us in the UK, the biggest driving force was this book that was written by Ruth Harrison. Ruth Harrison was not a scientist, and she was a Quaker by religion, so a very pacifist type of person. And the story goes is that she got handed a leaflet one day, I think back in 1961, outlining what was going on in UK agriculture at the time. She looked at that leaflet, read it, was horrified, and decided to do something about it. Excuse me. So her book, published in 64, was serialized by a major UK paper. And at that time, it caused uproar within the UK. Public outcry, government decided that they needed to look at it. They established what is called the Bramble Committee by the UK government. Ultimately, we had legislation enacted in 1968, the Agriculture Miscellaneous Provisions Act. Now, I would encourage you to pick up this book if you can. Still extremely relevant 60 years on. There is this newer version, which was probably, it might have been a 50th anniversary type of book. It's also got a load of good forewords by, all kind of companion papers up the front by a lot of eminent welfare scientists. Like I said, still completely relevant. 60 years ago, she was saying most people tend to be ignorant of the processes by which food reached their table. Absolutely still the case. And she at that time called for a ban on battery cages, veal crates, tethers, which was a similar confinement system to gestation crates, but with the sow actually physically tethered with a tether around the girth. And she was also saying, we should be banning slatted floors. Well, not an awful lot of has changed. I mean, maybe I think probably tethers don't really exist anymore now for sows, but we still have that close confinement system for sows. So still very pertinent. And like I say, I encourage you to pick that book up and read it. And Ruth was a lovely person as well. I was lucky enough to meet her. She did used to come up to Cambridge, and being as I was the one student with a car, I used to be the one tasked with picking her up and dropping her back at the railway station. But very happy to have met her and to have a few of those conversations in the car and in the journey between the vet school at Cambridge and the railway station. So the Bramble Committee, I'm bringing this up. We're not going to go through it in any detail. That was established, and it was given the remit to examine the conditions in which livestock are kept under systems of intensive husbandry and to advise whether standards ought to be set in their interests of their welfare. The main reason why I'm bringing up the Bramble Committee report is because within it, we actually had what became termed as the first five freedoms. But Bramble's five freedoms were quite different. Literally, Bramble's five freedoms were just this, that animals should have the freedom to stand up, lie down, turn around, groom themselves, stretch their limbs. So you will notice that these five freedoms are pretty dissimilar from what we know as the five freedoms that evolved from this. And if we move to the next slide, we can see that so the UK government also set up what they call the Farm Animal Welfare Council Committee. I can't remember what the C stands for. But amongst their charges, they then began to look kind of species by species to look at welfare within the UK and make recommendations. And as part of one of their early processes in 1979, we found that the five freedoms, as we know it now, were kind of published. And so now we have five freedoms from thirst, hunger, malnutrition, from discomfort and exposure, from pain, injury, and disease, from fear and distress, and freedom to express normal behavior. So those very original five freedoms out of Bramble really only kind of sat into those two. And so the other five freedoms really came from without of those Bramble five freedoms, but still very, very pertinent, very well regarded, and still quite often most used. If you Google search five freedoms, welfare, lots and lots of people are still using the five freedoms as a kind of foundation, I guess, in terms of how they consider welfare and how they approach animal welfare. Moving on from the five freedoms, David Mellor down in New Zealand kind of then came up with five domain approach. Slightly different, quite similar. We've still got five things which are really the five things that are in the five freedoms. But the way he has it set out is that those four, nutrition, environment, health, and behavior, are feeding through the fifth one, which is all about the mental domain. How is the animal feeling? To give an overall indication of the welfare state. There's the link to a later paper there. So the first kind of idea of the five domains came out in 94. There's a later paper there, 2020, which really goes into more detail and expansion. And I would recommend you reading that because it's a good paper. And so with South housing system design, whereas there is very little variation in gestation crate systems, group systems really can't be described by that one term group. Group systems almost offer infinite variety. You know, that's just a snapshot of what we've got. They're all group systems, but very, very different. So it's extremely difficult for us to do that kind of welfare comparison between crates and groups, because no group is created equal. I mean, I could almost say that no group is created equal. I mean, obviously, some of the larger producers are probably trying to do that by putting in exactly the same system across multiple farms, multiple barns. But even so, there's likely to be some factors which might vary slightly, which could mean that the systems will behave differently and the sows will behave differently within the systems. So what do I mean? So for example, building type, we could be indoor. We could have a type of hybrid system, maybe hoops or indoor house, but outdoor runs, outdoor access. We could be totally outdoor, like we are for probably about a third of the production now in the UK, maybe even more. And even then, we could house them within arks in small groups. We could house them in big bale tents like this picture. Feeding system is critical. We have to think about what level of control do we want? Do we want individual control, being able to feed each individual within a group a different amount depending on its needs? For that, we either need to shut them into feeding stalls and to be able to go through and give extra feed where we can to those sows that might be thin. Obviously, we have ESFs, which again do allow us to program individual amounts of feed for each sow. Do we go with group control? Do we go with floor feeding, for example, where we either just dump the food onto the floor, or in the UK, we used to have ones that are spin feeders. So rather than just a single dump into a pile, it would throw the food out in a larger radius. We could trough feed. The thing with trough feeding is that if I'm a sow that I eat quickly, I can finish my ration and quickly displace somebody else and eat some of their ration. A way to try and get over this is what they call a trickle feed. So rather than the sow's food being delivered in a single go, it is sort of dropped almost pellet by pellet. And the idea then is that all the sows are tied to their individual feeding spaces, eating at the same time, finish at the same time, and can't displace other sows. And then we can also think even about food type. Not very popular, but I've certainly seen some of these in Europe, liquid feeding systems. One of the supposed advantages of liquid feeding system is that you actually get less variation in eating speed. And so the fast eaters and the slow eaters kind of finish at the same time. And you don't get this displacement effect. And then if you're going to dry feed over here in the US, very much meal feeding. In Europe, in the UK, we would very much pellet feed. So different forms of feed again. Flooring. If we are going to go with bedded, what kind of bedding do we have? Very, very used to straw bedding in the UK. People are beginning to look at other things. If straw becomes scarce or expensive, corn stalks, for example, wood shavings, kind of peat or compost, deep bedded composting beds, for example. We go to non-bedded. Are we going to go with fully slatted floors, part slatted floors, solid floors? Are we going to go outside onto pasture, dirt lot, or in some cases woodland, silvopastoral types of systems? We think about grouping. Are we going to go with small groups, as in the bottom picture? Are we going to go with larger groups? Space allowance, you can almost pick a number. How much space are you going to give them? We kind of have that infinite variation in terms of what an amount of space sows can have. We're going to mix sows. Are we going to mix them once and try and keep that group static? Are we in a large group, for example? Maybe we're going to have monthly mixings of sows moving out, sows moving in, a dynamic system. If we are mixing, when do we mix? Are we going to mix our group, form our group at weaning? Do we wait 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks? Again, we've got that kind of infinite choices in some respects. So you can begin to see just how complex it is. And that's by no means an exhaustive list of considerations, but just looking at what I've written down there in those slides, we've got 4 different things. We've got all these potential choices. That alone gives us nearly 5,000 different types of group systems we could have, depending on which of those 4 elements we pick. And so this gives you an idea of why there is such variation in the science of, the welfare question of what is better, crates or groups. And over here, especially, obviously I moved from the UK. We had already answered that question. Europe had answered that question. We had decided that the welfare of sows in gestation crates was poorer than the welfare of sows in groups. But we have very different systems. So, it's fair enough that over here in the US, one of the first things that I started doing when I moved to the Livestock Behavior Research Unit with the USDA based at Purdue was to start researching crates versus groups again, because the group systems here were very different to the group systems that I was used to in Europe. And the science of groups versus crates within the US, or maybe within North America in general, has tended to be not particularly strong one way or the other. The more I've worked on it and the more that I've come to understand it, it's not, you'll see a lot from a producer point of view saying, and even ABMA, that they are both as good as each other. I would tend to use the opposite and say they are both usually as bad as each other. All you have done mostly over here is move from a very small space, barren environment, to a larger space, barren environment, and one where now the sows can interact and can interact aggressively, because there's really nothing much else in that environment to keep them occupied and for them to interact with. So that is one of the reasons I think, which is why we have not seen a very clear distinction of good welfare over here in group systems. And the other distinction would be what I referred to earlier, the fact that we have lost that skill set in terms of management, and that when we've moved to crates into groups, we have stock persons, carers who are not used to groups, and management is a key element. And so even in a university setting, where we've done these types of comparisons, we've found that, the groups have not met our expectations in terms of improving welfare. Anyway, the reality is that even though we have all this whole list of choices in terms of elements that we could bring into group housing, the reality is that conversion away from crates is going to be into indoor non-bedded systems. So the types of systems that we were just talking about. Okay, group size is going to vary. Feeding system, certainly we've got choice there. That's going to vary. Space allowance, is going to vary as well, unless we're wanting to be Prop 12 compliant. And there we've got quite strict details in terms of what we've got to give the sow. Mixing time likely is going to vary, but again, unless we're going to be Prop 12 compliant, in which terms we've got to be mixing um, after our sows are weaned. We cannot house them into service crates and mix them later on. So let's go with what AVMA has got in terms of its position. Obviously, that position has changed over time slightly, but it's still very much kind of sitting on that fence and saying that, there's a variety of housing systems and that we should be providing this list of things, and that most housing systems can provide that. We're not going to read through it because we can cover it a bit here on the next screen. When we then think about it in terms of those 5 domains, providing every animal access to appropriate food and water. Of course, we're going to do that because that's an absolute fundamental for the health and welfare of our sows. It really falls under number 1, number 3 in terms of those 5 domains. We're going to promote good air quality, allow proper sanitation. Probably majority of these lie under 2 and 3. Protect sows from environmental extremes, mostly under 2. Reduce exposure to hazards or conditions that result in injuries, pain, distress, fear, or disease, lie under 3 and under that 5 directly. Because bearing in mind, all of the 1, 2, 3, and 4 are feeding through 5, but some of these things will feed directly onto 5 without having to feed through those other 4 domains. Facilitate the observation of individual sows to assess their welfare. You want to look at things like body condition and obviously pick up any signs of injury or health issues. Provide sows with adequate quality, quantity of space that allow sows to assume normal postures and express normal patterns of behavior. Again, it's going to fall under that environment 1 majority and number 4 especially. And so they've really given us quite a shopping list there of things that the ideal sow housing system should have. They've also got a lit review that they've published, and that has got stalls, group pens, and free range as another column. I haven't gone into that. I'm sticking on the housing side of things. And then they are summarizing there was a table at the end, what they think stalls offer and group pens offer relative to various welfare indicators. And you'll see from the AVMA point of view, the stall is showing up 5 in the green, but on the other hand, 3 in the red. For the group pen, only 1 in the green, the vast majority in the yellow and red, saying that we've got increased risk. Well, let's have a look at some of these in a little bit more detail. Let's focus on access to food. So feeding system is extremely important. We'll have a quick look there at some of the productivity issues, or one of the major productivity issues that producers are quite rightly worried about. We're going to look at injuries because it ties into sow aggression. And we'll look at things like behavioral diversity, foraging opportunities. And so we can begin to then look at some of our systems. And if we take the gestation crate and think about what the AVMA position is and those things that this system should be providing, I think it would be my opinion that it's probably green for go on nutrition, but I would have it down as red on all the other 5 of the 5 domains. So the last 4 of the 5 domains, I would say that the gestation crate would come up red for me. And that is because I don't believe that this type of system reduces exposure to hazards. I don't believe that it really does facilitate observation of individual sows to assess their welfare. How can you do that if they're not moving around? Does it provide sows with adequate quality and quantity of space that allows sows to assume normal postures, express normal patterns of behavior? Absolutely not. So AVMA in their position, if they're going to look at this year maybe and revise it, it's absolutely my opinion that they should be revising it to say that this type of system does not meet what we have down as the provisions that are important. And so we should not say that this is an acceptable form of housing. And amongst the things that it says within its lit review is that one of the advantages of the gestation crate is that it protects from aggression. Um, okay, it does qualify that. So it says stallhouse sows are unlikely to receive injuries associated with physical aggression, but agonistic interactions may still occur between adjacent animals. And it is actually referencing one of my publications. But I wouldn't be quite so generous in terms of that kind of description of what it does in terms of protecting from aggression. And so I don't believe that it really, again, it's a red for me on 4 of those 5 domains. I mean, this work is quite old, but we go back to paper by my major professor, Don Broom et al., 1995. And in this particular study, we had 3 populations of sows, and these are the same sows that I actually used for my PhD. We kept them over long term, sort of 8 or 9 parities, either in gestation crates, either in small groups into which they had individual feeders, or they had a large group ESF. And what part of what they found in this paper during that first parity, they looked at the first graph here on the left is the number of agonistic interactions per hour. And they found that in that first parity, it was higher in the group house systems. And the proportion which escalate was, numerically higher within the group systems. By the time these sows had been through that's the same system each time, and the same measurements were taken in the fourth parity, no difference between the systems in terms of the number of interactions per hour, but those number of interactions that were escalating were much, much higher. Nearly a quarter of those interactions within gestation crates were escalating into, severe aggression. Of course, you're not getting those injuries because they can't physically interact. But over time, aggression is similar, but escalation is higher. And that kind of result is not unusual. There are other papers that also show that type of result. This is work out of Australia, John Barnett and colleagues down in Melbourne. Again, we're looking at, in this case, unmodified tether stalls. So again, a close confinement where the sows cannot physically interact with their neighbours versus groups where obviously they can. Total number, similar results, I guess. Total number of aggressive and non-aggressive interactions, higher in the group. Percent of aggressive interactions, so higher in the group. If you can't escape, which you can't in the unmodified tether stalls, you retaliate. Nearly half of those interactions are retaliation. Only 5% of those interactions in groups are retaliation. If you can escape, you withdraw. Obviously, you can't in a tethered stall. You can withdraw in a group, and that's a perfect and natural response to ending an aggressive interaction is being able to withdraw and get away from the aggressor sow. Of course, that can be influenced by the amount of space that you have within the pen. So, yes, we might well see a lack of physical impact, but I have absolutely no doubt that there is major psychological impact for unresolved aggression between sows kept within crate systems. So there had been some studies that had looked at aggression at mixing and found that if you could pre-expose a population of sows to a resident population, so if you've set up a pen within a pen, let those sows interact through the bars of the pen for 7 days, then remove the pen, you drastically reduce the amount of aggression that happens when you mix. I came up with this idea, and this was pork board funded, that, well, ordinarily we are taking sows at weaning and putting them into um, at weaning and putting them into service crates, and then we are drawing that population of sows and forming a group out of them. Well, what happens if you kind of get an idea of which sows you're going to mix into a group? So if you can house your neighbor, if you can house sows next to each other before grouping, is aggression greater or is it less? My hypothesis was that it was going to be less. So here we've got the three sort of turquoise sows. They're going to form a group. The three um, pinky purple sows are going to form a group. They've been housed next to each other. The other ones are randomly coming from different places along the line of service crates. I thought aggression is going to be less. In fact, what I found was that when you group them, the group sows aggression is more immediate, higher intensity, and more sustained between sows that are grouped next to each other. And so again, this to me is saying that, there, that unresolved aggression is a huge, huge issue when you have sows housed in crates next to each other. Aggression's going to happen. They can't resolve it. They can't figure it out. You give them the opportunity to do that, they go for it. And so, yeah. So my hypothesis was the opposite, or what happened was the opposite to my hypothesis, basically, and just reinforced to me the issue that, aggression is a major, major issue, psychological issue within crated sow population. So moving on to groups, ABMA are very much giving this long paragraph as to why aggression is a big disadvantage within a group situation. And we can look at that in more detail. The two major opportunities for aggression in sows are when sows are mixed and when sows are fed. Mixing, of course, is that formation of a social hierarchy, and feeding, well, it's access to and defense of scarce resources. Well, the good news is that you can influence both of these by system design and good old-fashioned husbandry. And we'll go through some of this. Sow feeding options, we covered that a little bit on that first slide. We've got different ways that we can feed the sow. If we want to start on the far left-hand side, that kind of dump feeder, floor feed the sow. Clearly, that's a very competitive type of feeding system. This was work that I wasn't involved in. A colleague was involved in back in the UK back in the 90s, Adas Terrington, looking at dump feeding either into unbedded pens or pens with a lot of straw in them. Again, with one of these things where the hypothesis was that, oh, you've got lots of straw in the pen and you're dump feeding into the straw, you're going to get lots of rooting, lots of foraging, and you're going to get less aggression. She found the opposite. So what could happen is in this system on the concrete, the sows could clearly see where the food was and they'd see how much there was. They didn't fight over it so much. If you dump it into straw, it disappeared into the straw. So all of a sudden that food became an even scarcer resource and it led to more fighting. But floor feeding is competitive. The next one we'll go to is actually, that's a liquid feed system out of Sweden. So the trough fills with liquid. Again, we mentioned why liquid sow eating speed is more consistent within the group, but that's still a competitive system. We move to the next one. We can see again trough feeding, but now we begin to build in little head barriers or head and shoulder barriers, again to try and stop that aggression of displacement between the sows along the trough. The next one is that trickle feed system. So we're trying to tie the sow into their feeding compartment, if you like, so that they're not displacing and not fighting. And then the final one down the bottom is this is free access crates, but we're feeding in the crates, the sow goes in, gate closes behind. So the sow is protected within that type of system and there's no real competition for feeding in that type of system. ESFs, electronic sow feeders, are protect that sow when she's in there to feed, but depending on the design of the system, you can get aggression at the entrance. So it's kind of different. But what you can be sure of is that sow is going to get her ration, her full ration, and you can also tailor that amount to each individual sow. And these systems have got more and more complex as we've learnt how to build ESFs. And you begin to see, in the old ones, a lot of the time the sow could come out of the feeder and go straight back to want to go back in again. If she was a dominant sow, you'd find that the dominant sows would be, every other sow in that feeder until she finally gives up and goes away. Of course, the subordinate sows aren't going to congregate when that computer switches over. It's the dominant sows that will be the first one in on a daily basis. Subordinate sows could pick a time, sometimes in the middle of the night when they know there's no other sows queuing up for that feeder and go in and not have any aggression. But we can see how the designs have changed and they're more complex. We can look at and you can begin to build in other management things that help. You can segregate the sows. Let's go to the next one and look at the plan of that. So when the sows go through the feeder, if she's due for vaccination, rather than being able to exit into the main pen, she gets kicked into the separating pen for treatment for whatever. Likewise, there's now heat detection. There might be a boar here, and we know that if the sow comes and visits the boar, next time she goes through the cycle, again, she'll get kicked out because we know that she's in heat for some reason, and shouldn't be in the gestation system. So there are a number of management things that can be built into an ESF system. We see those divisions within the sleeping areas. Again, they can really play a part. We've got partitions that sows can get out of the way of aggression and hide behind. We've got designated kind of lying areas that can almost become their own personal lying areas. You'll find subgroups form within the main pen and they will occupy one lying area preferentially, and other sows will occupy other lying areas, again, reducing the amount of aggressive interactions that happen. When we think about the life cycle of breeding sows, we've got choices of when we can mix. So we could mix them at weaning. We can mix them as we take them out of lactation and put them into service. We can mix them between service and entry into gestation, or we can mix them direct into the gestation system. One of the major worries about this from a production point of view is what impact is this going to have on pregnancy? Mixing strategy effect on reproduction is not particularly clear, and there's not a lot of very well designed studies that have looked at it. We've got studies that show that compared to litter production in comparing groups to stalls are better, similar, or worse. And some of this is to do with when that mixing happens within a group situation. So here's one study looking at days after breeding and when we're going to group those sows. Control is never being grouped, or do we group them at day 2 after breeding, day 7, day 14, 21, 28? And then we look at farrowing percentage, so the number that actually go through to farrowing that don't return. We find that if they're mixed at day 14, we have the highest return rate. Litter size not particularly impacted within this one study, but we begin to know that there are certain times that we don't want to mix our sows. Another really good study out of Prairie Swine Centre by Jem Brown and colleagues, looking again at early mixing. So this one, sows are mixed directly at weaning, or sows are mixed 35 days after breeding. And she had what she called a pre-socialization. So she mixes them briefly for 48 hours at weaning, then they're put into stalls for breeding and remixed at day 35. This is just the idea of the housing system, free access stalls, 24 square feet per sow, so very relevant to Prop 12. The stalls are only used for feeding, otherwise the sows are locked out in this central lying area. And what she found was actually when she did this early mixing, that's a well, both for that and the pre-socialization are phenomenally high conception rates, quite honestly, 98%, 94% compared with that late mixing 87%. Um, and then they also found that in terms of litter performance, no difference in terms of total litter size, you know, not significant, but numerical advantage in terms of born alive for early mixing, and a significant advantage in terms of born dead for early mixing. And so that's a really great study looking at Prop 12 space allowances and looking at mixing straight out of lactation again, which would be quite Prop 12 compliant. And this was funded by the Port Board. So it's completely pertinent and relevant information. I can't find that Jen has necessarily published this as a full paper, but it's available as a full report on the National Port Board website. I will search more and actually ask Jen for details of the paper. And I know Jen Yun Chu is actually on the call as well, and she's at the Prairie Swine Centre now. Maybe she knows more details of this particular study, although it's obviously carried out quite a long time before the current Jen was on staff. But it's a really interesting paper, really interesting study. So what happens when you do mix sows? We do get aggression. For sure, we get aggression, but it's brief. Here again, work out of Terrington, we see in the ESF system, we are seeing brief interactions, a lot of them in that first hour, but it decreases quite quickly. We see one-sided fights, two-sided fights, not a lot. And again, it goes down to a baseline very, very quickly. We see this little hump because it's an ESF system and the computer is switching over every 24 hours. So at that 24-hour switchover, we see a little bump in aggression again. But again, it's much, much reduced. So it's short-lived, or it should be short-lived. If it's not, then there is something wrong with the system. Can we reduce aggression? There are a number of ways that we can influence aggression. There are some ways that have been tried that don't work. Some ways that, initially they give a positive result, but when you look at it longer term, they don't. Chemical intervention, for example, that's one where people have looked at sedating sows when you mix them. And lo and behold, for the first few hours, you get very little aggression. When the sedation wears off, you get the aggression ramp up because it's worn off. Time of day, if you mix just prior to lights out, you get low aggression, but next day lights come on, new sows are in the group, aggression starts up. So some of these things work in the short term and not in the long term. And other things we've got down there do work. And I have a review paper there in Pig News and Information that goes through all the various types of ways to reduce aggression. And if you want more information, then that's a good source of it. So space is going to be the important one that we're going to cover in a bit more detail. Little evidence for optimum space allowance to reduce aggression. Aggression may be reduced at high density, but only initially. Again, work out of Australia. We see first off that aggression seems to be low in that first period, but when we're looking further out, days 3 to 10, we've got higher aggression at that tight space allowance. Limited space in the longer term may actually result in increased aggression and higher lesion scores. Work out of SRUC or SAC as it was back there in the late 90s. Again, when we're looking at 2.4 square, so 24 square feet is around 2.25 square meters. So that Prop 12 compliant space allowance would be between the first two categories, if you like, here. And it's not till you start really going out in terms of space do you see that real positive effect of space on aggression. Is space alone enough? Well, no, not really. Again, we've talked about the idea that all we are doing is giving the sow more barren space. Where that 2.4 square meters has come from is not clear from a science point of view. you need to go way, way higher if you really want to see a full impact of pure space in terms of reducing aggression. But even that 2.4 square meters, you can get very different impacts of that amount of space depending on the type of system that you have, and even such simple things as the shape of the pen. A square pen that's 2.4 square meters, you could get different results to a rectangular pen at 2.4 square meters. So it's really not a gold standard in terms of space that cures the problem. Future trends, well, I think pressure is probably mounting to change space in pig production. So we're very much focused on this quantity. We're thinking of that space allowance. We want to move to group gestation. We're also not so much over here in the US yet, trying to get out of farrowing crates as well into pen systems, so more space. We keep looking at that quantity. What we've got to be doing is looking more and more at that quality. There are certain things that you can do to a space that improve it in terms of aggression. We've talked about the feeding system. You can do something as simple as putting a central partition down a pen. That gives the ability for the sow to get around and behind it and out of sight, out of mind, to be able to withdraw. We can think about that flooring substrate, fully slatted systems, restrict what we can do in terms of other qualitative changes. We'd like to think about environmental choice. Can we have different light zones? Can we have different thermal zones? If we have any option to have some solid flooring, can we actually put in some kind of bedding, some kind of chop straw even? So even if it does get into the pit, it's not going to mess things up. Can we give that sow some control over her environment? And then we can think about enrichment as well. What can we add that will enrich the pen, enrich the lives of those animals? Because ultimately what we are trying to do is to improve welfare. We are trying to improve the emotional state of our animals. We're trying to improve health. We're trying to improve productivity. So something as simple as flooring, for example, here it's basically the same type of system. We've got free access crates. We've got fully slatted system. We've got part slatted. So here we've got some of that flooring out of the slatted area is solid. Well, if we've got some solid flooring, can we then move to putting something on that solid flooring that gives the sow something to interact with, gives them some environmental choice? You see where we've got some chopped straw, we've got sows lying out there because thermally it offers different environment than lying in the gestation crate. And then, of course, we go, I think this is actually out of it might be at Chogga, Scav Island, Moor Park. I'm not entirely sure, but it's back over in Europe where we've got full straw-based system in the lying area. So we can have the same type of system, tweak part of it, and get quite different results. Enrichment. Couple of things here. So even on fully slatted systems, we can enrich those environments. We can introduce things into the environment that will, give the pigs something to do other than either carry out agonistic interactions with each other or carry out other, behaviors which are not positive, belly nosing, for example, in our younger pigs, the types of behaviors that we don't want to see. The one for the sow is a molasses block out of Australia, work that we did at Purdue just before I left, suspending that into a pen, and then looking to see how that might impact post-mixing aggression. It decreased it. The other one is that one, I'll just play it again. Suspending sort of rubber and plastic, not ideal as enrichments in terms of the qualities they possess, but did it have positive impacts? Yes, it did compared to nothing. Yeah, it did. Is it ideal enrichment? No, not necessarily. What we need to think about is that pressure for us to change can be coming from sources where we don't necessarily expect it. So my enrichment work, for example, was actually sponsored by Nestle, and Nestle are part of the Global Coalition for Animal Welfare, um, a large collective of people, big names in there. We see out of the US, Kroger, for example, are in there. We know Sodexo, Aramark, big food companies. These are big guys and they're global. So Nestle's reason for sponsoring environmental enrichment work, they were putting pressure on Smithfield, who provide them with toppings for their pizzas over here in the US. They will be saying, like, we are getting our pork from this type of system under this type of welfare in Europe, for example. We should be getting this. If that is our benchmark for welfare, we should be using that same benchmark globally. And so we should be expecting you, as our US supplier, to be meeting the types of welfare requirements that we're expecting our European suppliers to meet. You need to be meeting it. So no doubt, industry over here is going to be influenced, is going to be pressured by the customer, whether that be, consumer, public at home, but the big guys as well. Last slide, basically. So what are we hoping to achieve by improving animal welfare? A whole lot of things, I think. We are trying to improve industry image. We can improve social sustainability, economic sustainability. We can reduce the risk of legislation. If we voluntarily make changes, we reduce the risk of having changes enforced. It is a better type of environment to work in. It is much nicer environment to work in, improve worker recruitment, retention, improve worker self-worth. You've got to improve their skill set. We really want to try and change that narrative to quality over quantity. We don't necessarily want to be eating more and more animal protein, but what we want to be doing is trying to change people's perspective and be working on, we should be going for quality over quantity. And in improving animal welfare, we should be reducing that need for antimicrobials. So we're having that One Health impact as well. And I'm very sorry if I've gone long on that, but that is my last slide. And thank you very much for listening. Happy to take some questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Marchant. Before we transition to the Q&A, I just want to let our audience know that we'll be hosting a virtual day-long symposium this fall focused on evidence-based approaches to improving farm animal living environments. So stay tuned as the symposium date, October 18th, approaches. So we'll now have a short Q&A session. If you need to drop off now, please make sure to complete the short survey about today's webinar. And our first question for Jeremy is, it feels like there's a huge focus on aggression when it comes to group housing. Is that the dominant barrier to pursuing this housing model? How do you convince producers that aggression can be addressed? And is some amount of aggression to be expected? How much is too much?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the first primary barrier is going to be cost of conversion before anything else. But when you move to group housing, well, when you look at what I presented there, you see it listed quite prominently as a disadvantage for group housing on that AVMA lit review. And you see it listed as a predominant advantage still for crates. So it is a big issue and it is a big concern for producers. Like I said, it's if you're getting aggression that is lasting more than a couple of days and it's sustained, you have a deficiency somewhere in the system. it is natural. You are never going to eradicate aggression. All we can do, and there are that whole load of management things. Look at that review that I wrote in Pig News and Information. It's probably not very accessible, but it might be. I've probably got it on my research gate or something like that. But it does give you a list of options of things that have been tried and have been known to work. So we can reduce it. It takes skill as well. There are ways you can manipulate it. Um, how many sows, there's all sorts of things. How many sows you mix in? Do you form a subgroup of sows before you mix them into the main group? Are you going to mix sows that are all the same size together? Quite often we do that because we are more concerned with things like body condition. If we will mix sows that look all about the same size and the same body condition, especially if we don't have individual feeding control, because we want to have all those sows get back into condition at the same time. Well, we know from natural behavior that uniformity is not necessarily a good thing when we mix animals. So, as you learn to manage the system, it's like, well, if I put one big one in, with a couple of medium size and one small one, that's kind of naturally going to work its way through into hierarchy. Hierarchy still is very much parity based, so size is definitely an issue. I mean, you do occasionally get low parity small sows that are more aggressive. Your genetics plays a part as well. And again, as you learn the system, you tweak the system. Um, I remember being at an ASAS, American Society of Animal Science conference, years and years ago, and they had a symposium on group housing, and they had a Danish producer come over to talk. And, he gave a very honest talk in terms of his transition from a crated system to a group housing system. And by that stage, I think they were about 3 or 4 years in. And all the graphs were still pointing up in terms of where they were going in terms of productivity, and he was very clear to say that we are still learning our system. We are still making changes. So it's not going to be an instant transition that suddenly everything is, smelling roses and going great. And because we don't have the skill set either in our workforce. So it takes time to learn, but there are definitely things we can do to keep that aggression at a low level.
That question relates to what you were talking about, especially when you mentioned cost of conversion as a huge barrier. In the US, what would be the most effective first steps to improve sow welfare in a group setting that may be accepted by commercial operations? How can we provide incentives for producers to transition to these higher welfare systems and move beyond simply, increasing space allowances to comply with Prop 12?
Probably introducing enrichment, I think, would probably be a great first step. Like I said, we're not very definitely, improving welfare necessarily by going from the crate systems into a lot of the group systems that we have. If we're just moving them into a barren environment, yes, they have space. They can begin to at least socially interact. Yes, some of that social interaction is going to be negative social interactions, but there'll be some positive social interactions as well. Um, Definitely some good environmental enrichment work going on up in Canada at the Prairie Swine Centre and University of Saskatoon. So they are looking at environmental enrichment within the types of fully slatted, part slatted systems that we have here in North America. And so if I was going to recommend, what can I do to add to our group systems, I would say investigate environmental enrichment and what you can do in that area.
And to follow up with enrichments, um, do we have an understanding of the most critical enrichments that help reduce aggression? Pigs spend most of their time foraging. Is there a way to help facilitate this behavior in a facility, for example, without bedding? Or is bedding just really essential to performing this behavior?
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky one when it comes to, slatted systems. like I said, definitely within Ireland, there's been a lot of good stuff going on because they are invariably quite intense in terms of slatted systems. So, you don't have to necessarily put bedding down. There are ways to bring in things like straw in racks, and if the straw is chopped, there are ways that slurry systems can handle it. Um, Wood is another way to introduce some kind of, foraging and manipulable objects. Um, yeah, it can be done. I mean, I didn't in the types of stuff that I was looking at. It was very much the kind of off the shelf rubber and plastic because I thought, well, rather than try to pitch straight into something, something um, uh, fibrous can become a biosecurity issue as well, or a barrier. Because they think, oh, well, I don't really want to introduce anything organic into what I'm doing, and so I thought, well, a first step forward in terms of enrichment over here would be to move towards, yeah, the plastic, the rubber type things that can be, properly made biosecure as they come into the system. But I was seeing that even those, even though, I would probably class them as certainly non-ideal enrichment objects, were having impact, were improving welfare. Um, because almost anything is better than nothing in this situation. But you do want to, really look and see what you can do. And like I say, look at the stuff coming out of Prairie Swine Centre, look at the stuff that's come out of Skin Island, and those will be most relevant to the types of things that could be introduced.
Yeah, and I know where I work, we use a lot of the cotton rope,
Hmm.
which is just a very cheap option, and they seem to really enjoy enrichment that they can destroy. It
Absolutely.
seems to really give some satisfaction. Also, in terms of enrichment, how important is synchronous accessibility in terms of enrichment objects? So I know this was something that I came across with research with non-human primates, not necessarily with pigs, but that enrichment, when it's not synchronously accessible, can actually be this innocuous way for an animal to assert dominance. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that in relation to pigs.
Yeah, it can be for sure. And especially early on because it's novel. So there's definitely always a novel effect, and so everybody wants it at the same time. But again, depending on that quality of that enrichment, that novelty does wear off over time as well. But often a lot of people will bring in a kind of replacement strategy, so whereby you're cycling different types of enrichment through. Um, in some way, I've never, I haven't done it in large groups, so I haven't ever found it limiting in terms of, for the sow blocks, for example, I think I had groups of 4, 8, and 12, and for the 12 I had two, for the 4 and the 8 I had one. It never became a resource that was defended. The other way is how you present it. So if you saw for a lot of these things are hanging. And so when they're hanging, they're very hard for a single animal, single pig to defend. But they also become, multi pigs can use that at the same time, and it isn't an issue. If you have something nailed to a wall or tied to a gate, so when I first put the sow block in, I did make the mistake of chaining it to one gate, and it lasted like no time at all. For a start, they could really get hold of it and grip it and bite it and eat it quickly, but it also became defendable. Um, it became something that, they pulled down and destroyed and knocked onto the floor quickly. As soon as I hung it from the ceiling, presented it in a different way, it still retained that novelty and that attraction, but it lasted and they couldn't defend it and lots could use it at the same time. So, you have to think about it. Different manufacturers will give you an idea of how many you should use per number of animals. Um, so there will be some information out there if you're going to buy stuff off the rack, so to speak. But otherwise, it's a question of, trying it. If you put one thing in and you realize that it's causing issues, well, then put two, put three. Yeah, it's experience again.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, we do have more questions. There's a lot of interest, but just in the interest of time, we'll conclude things now. I really want to thank you again for sharing your expertise on these topics with us. And thank you everyone for attending this webinar. We'll be posting a recording of the webinar on VAFAW's website in the coming days, and certificates of participation for CE credit will be emailed over the next week to veterinarians and veterinary technicians who attended. A reminder to please fill out the short survey that will show up on your screen after the webinar ends. And finally, the AVMA is currently reviewing its policy on pregnant sow housing, and VAFAW has submitted comments to the Animal Welfare Committee for consideration. There may be opportunities in the coming months for AVMA members to offer feedback on this very important policy. So if you join VAFA as a member, you can receive updates on this issue and more webinars about farm animal welfare. And again, the first year of membership is free. If you have any questions, please email us at info@vafa.org. And thank you again, Dr. Marchant, and thank you again for joining us tonight.
You're welcome. And I mean, if any burning questions, feel free to email me, of course.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much.